I just wanted to buy a birthday gift for my little brother. Instead, a woman screamed for security and pointed at me like I was a criminal. She grabbed my arm, insisting I didn't belong in her store. I stood there, humiliated, while she called me a thief in front of strangers. 3 days later, everything about that woman's life started falling apart. Because the trespasser she threw out was the daughter of the man who owned her store's lease. And when my father walked through those doors, Diane Whitfield's whole world stopped. My name is Amara Johnson, 17, and I grew up watching my father build something out of nothing. Marcus Johnson started Sterling Group in a rented office with 2 employees. Now it owns retail plazas and residential developments across 3 states. Despite the money, my parents raised me to never lead with his title, to earn respect quietly, and to never assume anyone owed me anything. We just moved into Brookstone Estates, a gated community my father's company had developed years earlier before handing daily management to a local HOA board. It was supposed to be a fresh start, good schools, quiet streets, a clean page after my mother's health scare that spring. I never expected the neighborhood's little shopping plaza to become a battlefield. Brookstone's plaza had one boutique everyone talked about, Whitfield and Company, run by Diane Whitfield, the HOA president herself. Neighbors said she kept standards high, which really meant she decided who felt welcome and who didn't. My mother warned me on our first week, smile at her, but don't expect warmth back. Diane had run the HOA for 11 years, unopposed, mostly because nobody wanted the headache of challenging her. She approved every paint color, every mailbox style, every holiday decoration. People joked that Brookstone had 2 governments, the county and Diane. I first saw her at a community mixer, holding court by the dessert table, correcting a new family's fence height like she was reciting scripture. She had a way of smiling while delivering an insult, so smooth you almost thanked her for it. My father rarely attended HOA events. Sterling Group had sold its stake in the community's management years back, keeping only the commercial leases in the plaza, including Diane's storefront. Nobody at Brookstone actually knew who owned that lease. That anonymity was about to matter more than any of us realized. Our family kept a low profile on purpose. My dad believed flaunting success invited resentment before you'd even done anything to earn it. So when we walked into Whitfield and Company, that first month, we were just another family shopping for a gift, dressed casually, no logos, no entourage. I noticed Diane watching me the moment I walked past the jewelry counter. It wasn't curiosity. It was suspicion, sharp and immediate, the kind reserved only for people she'd already decided didn't fit her picture of a customer. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, though it didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a test I was already failing. I said I was looking for a gift for my brother's birthday. She glanced at my sneakers, then my bag, like she was pricing me. I brushed it off. A look deserves a reaction. My mother always said, "Pick your battles." I found a model car set for my brother, tucked it under my arm, and kept browsing while Diane trailed 2 aisles behind me the entire time. A younger employee, a woman named Priya, tried to help me instead, offering suggestions warmly. Diane cut in twice, redirecting Priya to restock the front, which conveniently kept her personally shadowing me. I didn't understand yet how much Diane hated losing control of a room. When I reached the register, Diane appeared instead of Priya, arms crossed. "That item's part of a display set," she said flatly, nodding at the model car in my hands. It wasn't. Shelf marked for sale. Tag and all. I pointed at the tag, confused. Diane's jaw tightened. She said, already reaching for her phone, already deciding, before any verification, that something here was wrong, and that I was the wrong thing. That evening I told my parents about the odd interaction, more amused than upset. My mother frowned. "Knowing exactly who you are," she said. "It makes them nervous. And nervous people who have a little power get ugly fast." I didn't think much of the warning yet. A week later I went back for the wrapping paper I'd forgotten. Alone this time, still in school clothes, backpack over one shoulder. Diane was at the register when I walked in, and her expression shifted the second the door chime rang. She'd remembered me, for all the wrong reasons. "You're the girl from last week," she said. Not a greeting, more an accusation. I nodded, said I just needed wrapping paper. She followed me down the aisle again. Closer this time, arms folded, radiating the kind of impatience usually reserved for actual wrongdoing. I grabbed the first roll of wrapping paper I saw and turned to leave. Diane stepped directly into my path. "I'm going to need you to open your bag," she said, loud enough that two other customers turned to look. My stomach dropped. "For what?" I asked, genuinely stunned. "Store policy," she said, though no sign anywhere mentioned bag checks. And Priya, restocking nearby, visibly flinched at the claim. I felt every eye in the store land on me at once. I opened my backpack anyway, more out of shock than compliance, revealing textbooks, a water bottle, my wallet, nothing else. Diane barely glanced inside before pivoting. "Some items have gone missing lately," she said. "And you've been in here twice this month," as if that alone made me a suspect. "I bought something last time," I said, voice shaking now. "I have the receipt at home." Diane's smile turned thin and cold. "Convenient," she said, already walking toward the door to hold it open for me. Not politely, but pointedly, like she was escorting out a trespasser. "You need to leave," she said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "We can't have people loitering who aren't actually buying anything." I hadn't loitered. I'd been in the store 4 minutes. I felt heat rise in my face, humiliation mixing with disbelief. I left without the wrapping paper, without a word, walking fast through the parking lot so nobody would see me cry. In the car, I sat gripping the steering wheel, replaying every second, wondering what exactly I had done except exist in a store that wasn't mine to belong in. Apparently, I didn't tell my parents that night. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight, that maybe I'd misread her tone, that maybe I was being dramatic. Teenagers do that, they shrink their own pain to keep the peace at home. I went to bed telling myself it was nothing, but it wasn't nothing to my body. I stopped wanting to walk past that side of the plaza. I took the long way to the pharmacy. I stopped mentioning Brookstone's shops at all. And my mother, sharp as always, noticed the sudden silence and started asking questions. "Something happened at that boutique," she said one night. Not a question. I finally told her everything, the bag search, the accusation, The way Diane had said loitering, like I was already guilty of something worse. My mother's face went very still and very calm, which was somehow scarier than anger. You did nothing wrong, she said, and meant it fully. But I need you to write down everything. Dates, times, exactly what she said. I didn't understand yet why she wanted it documented so precisely. My mother rarely explained her reasoning until she was ready to use it. The next weekend, my father took me back to the plaza, casually, like we were just running errands together. He wanted to see Diane Whitfield for himself, without introducing himself, without revealing anything. He believed people showed their real character fastest to someone they assumed had no power at all. We walked into Whitfield and Company. Together, my dad in worn jeans and a plain jacket, nothing that screamed money or status. Diane greeted him warmly within seconds, complimenting his handsome daughter, completely unaware she was speaking to the very man who signed her store's lease every quarter. I watched her transform in real time, sugary, attentive, offering him coffee from a little machine near the register. The contrast was almost comical if it hadn't been so infuriating. My father smiled politely, asked a few harmless questions about the neighborhood, and said nothing about who he was. On the drive home, he was quiet for a long stretch. Finally he said, "She's not confused about people. She's very precise about who she decides matters." I didn't fully understand what he meant yet, but something in his voice told me this wasn't going to just fade away quietly. That week, Diane held her monthly HOA meeting, and my mother, newly curious, decided to attend for the first time since we'd moved in. Diane ran it like a courtroom where she was judge, jury, and the only lawyer allowed to speak. Nobody challenged her, not once, the entire 90 minutes. Afterward, an older neighbor named Louise pulled my mother aside quietly. "Watch yourselves with her," Louise whispered. She decided the Ramirez family didn't fit 2 years ago and made their lives miserable until they moved. My mother thanked her, filing the name away carefully. The way she filed everything now, I started noticing small things I hadn't before. A black delivery driver questioned twice at the plaza gate. A Latino teenager followed through Whitfield and Company. Just like I had been. It was a pattern, quiet and repeated, that most people simply didn't see or chose not to. My mother began quietly reaching out, first to Louise, then to 2 other families who'd had similarly strange run-ins with Diane over the years. Nobody had ever compared notes before. Everyone assumed their own experience was an isolated misunderstanding. It wasn't. And Diane was its only architect. Meanwhile, my father made a discreet call to Sterling Group's property division, asking for the file on the Whitfield and Company. Lease payment history, complaint records, anything relevant. He said nothing dramatic on the call, just calm, deliberate curiosity. I didn't yet understand how much that single phone call would matter. The file came back within 2 days, and it wasn't flattering. Diane's store had missed lease payments twice in the past year, quietly covered late with penalty fees. There had also been 3 prior complaints filed against her for customer treatment, all closed without action because no one above her had ever pushed back. My father didn't act on any of it yet. He believed in patience, in letting a person's behavior speak fully for itself before consequences arrived. People like that always escalate, he told my mother. Give her enough rope, and she'll show you exactly who she is. He wasn't wrong. 2 weeks passed quietly, almost too quietly. I avoided the plaza entirely, throwing myself into school and swim practice instead. Then my little brother Caleb, 10 years old, asked if he could ride his bike to the plaza's ice cream shop with 2 friends from the neighborhood, all on his own for the first time. My mother agreed, on the condition he text her the second he arrived. Caleb was thrilled, pedaling off with his friends Jordan and Miles, sunscreen still glistening on his forehead. Felt like a normal, unremarkable Saturday afternoon. Normal afternoons, I was learning, could turn without warning. 20 minutes later, my mother's phone rang, not a text, a call, which immediately worried her. It was Caleb, voice trembling, saying a woman had grabbed his bike and told him and his friends they weren't allowed to be near the shops without an adult. My mother's calm evaporated instantly. She and I drove over together, arriving to find Diane standing between 3 10-year-olds and their bikes, arms crossed, clearly enjoying the standoff. Community policy, Diane announced the moment we approached. Minors aren't permitted unsupervised near commercial storefronts. No such policy existed anywhere in Brookstone's actual bylaws. My mother's voice stayed level, but it had an edge I'd rarely heard. Which bylaw number is that? Diane? Diane hesitated, just a flicker, before recovering. It's understood practice, she said. We can't have children running wild, scaring off customers. Jordan and Miles hadn't done anything but eat ice cream. These children are 10, my mother said. Eating ice cream on a public sidewalk in a neighborhood their families pay dues to live in. Diane's smile thinned into something colder. Perhaps your family should review our community standards more carefully, she said. Since you're clearly new here, the word new landed with unmistakable weight. It wasn't about being new to the neighborhood. It was about not yet being someone Diane had decided to respect. My mother took Caleb's hand, thanked Diane with icy politeness, and walked us all straight to the car without another word. That night, my parents sat at the kitchen table long after Caleb went to bed, voices low but serious. My father finally said what he'd apparently been holding back for weeks. She's not going to stop on her own. People who build their whole identity on control don't back down, they escalate. My mother agreed, but pushed back gently on rushing anything. If we move too fast, too visibly, she'll just call it retaliation and paint us as the aggressors, she said. Let her keep doing exactly what she's doing. Let the record build itself. My father nodded slowly, already thinking 3 steps ahead. The following Monday, my mother started a simple shared document. Time-stamped entries from every family Louise had connected her with, dates, incidents, exact quotes when people remembered them. It wasn't a HOA complaint yet. It was quiet groundwork, the kind Diane had no idea was even being laid. Diane, meanwhile, seemed to interpret our silence as surrender. She grew bolder at the next HOA meeting, proposing a new community appearance and conduct policy that conveniently gave the board, meaning her, broad authority to fine or restrict residents for vague, disruptive behavior. Passed unopposed. Again, Louise texted my mother immediately after the meeting. She's building herself a weapon and calling it a rulebook. My mother read it twice, then forwarded it straight to my father with one line added, This isn't about a boutique anymore. This is a pattern of institutional control. A week later, the new policy got its first test. Not on us, but on an elderly Filipino couple. The Cruzes fined $200 for hosting a small birthday gathering with too many cars on their own driveway. Nobody else's gatherings had ever been measured that way before. Mrs. Our door in tears, having heard through Louise that my mother was quietly documenting things. She brought her own notes, photographs of neighbors' identical gatherings that had never drawn a single complaint. The pattern kept confirming itself, incident by incident, family by family. My mother added the Cruz complaint to the growing file, now 6 families deep, each describing some version of the same dynamic, selective enforcement, sudden accusations, rules invented on the spot and applied unevenly. It was no longer a suspicion. It was becoming undeniable. On paper, in dates and names, I still hadn't gone back into Whitfield and Company myself, and honestly didn't plan to. But fate, or bad luck, had other ideas. My school project partner, Sophie, lived 2 doors from Diane and needed to swing by the plaza to grab supplies for our shared history presentation. It's fine. She probably won't even remember you, Sophie said, oblivious to everything that had happened. I almost said no. A school project, and I refused to let one woman rearrange my entire life around avoiding a single storefront. I walked in anyway. Diane spotted me instantly, the way a hawk spots movement in tall grass. Her posture changed before I'd even reached the poster board aisle. "You're back," she said. Not a greeting, a challenge. Like my presence alone was an act of defiance she intended to correct immediately. "Just grabbing supplies for a school project," I said calmly, holding up the poster board already in my hands. Diane's eyes narrowed anyway. "We've had thefts reported recently," she said, loud enough for Sophie to hear. "So I'll need to keep an eye on you specifically this time." Sophie's face went pale with second-hand embarrassment. "She didn't do anything," Sophie said quietly. But Diane waved her off entirely, focused only on me. "I know how these things work," Diane said. "Young girls come in pairs. One distracts while the other pockets merchandise." I felt my hands start shaking. I set the poster board down slowly, deliberately, and said, "I'd like your name and the store's complaint procedure, please." Diane blinked, clearly unused to being asked for accountability instead of simply obeyed. "Excuse me?" she said. "I said I'd like documentation of this accusation," I repeated. Steadier now. Diane's composure cracked slightly, just enough to show the anger underneath the polish. "You don't get to demand anything in my store," she snapped. "Actually," Sophie interjected nervously, "this is a public retail space." "Not." Diane cut her off sharply. "I decide what happens in this store." I didn't argue further. Calmly, and said, "I'm going to record this conversation for my own records, since you've now accused me of theft twice without any evidence." Diane lunged slightly toward my phone, then caught herself, aware other customers were watching closely now. "Get out," she said, voice sharp enough to carry across the whole store. "Both of you." Now, Sophie, humiliated and confused, grabbed her half-finished supplies and pulled me toward the door. I walked out with my head high, but my chest was pounding with anger I hadn't let myself feel before. That evening, I told my parents everything, including that I'd recorded part of the confrontation. My father watched the video twice, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking. "This is enough," he said quietly. "Not to destroy her. Finally has to answer for something." My mother asked what he meant exactly. "I'm going to introduce myself to Diane Whitfield," he said. "Properly." It wasn't anger in his voice. It was something colder and more deliberate. The tone he used before major business decisions, not personal ones. This felt different and heavier. The next morning, my father called Sterling Group's regional property manager, requesting a formal, scheduled walkthrough of the Brookstone Plaza standard practice, technically, for any landlord checking on tenant conditions. Diane had no idea the walkthrough had anything to do with her personally, or with me at all. He scheduled it for the following Thursday afternoon, deliberately during the plaza's busiest hour, when the most people would be present to witness whatever unfolded. My mother asked if that was necessary. "Some lessons only land," he said, "when there's an audience who can't be denied later." Word had apparently reached the HOA board that ownership representatives were coming to inspect the plaza, though nobody mentioned names. Diane, ever the control enthusiast, decided to personally oversee her storefront's presentation that day, polishing counters, rearranging displays, utterly unaware whose approval she was actually about to seek. I asked my father if I should come along. He considered it, then said yes, not to confront Diane, but simply to be present, quietly, as his daughter. "Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be announced," he said. "It just needs to walk through the door." Thursday arrived with a strange, electric quiet in our house, the kind before a storm nobody's naming out loud. My mother pressed my father's collar flat before we left, a small habit of hers before anything important. Caleb asked why everyone seemed so serious over just a store visit. Nobody answered him directly. We arrived at the plaza just after 2. The regional property manager, a woman named Renee, already waiting near the fountain with a clipboard and a folder thick with paperwork. Diane spotted them first, practically gliding over in her best blazer, hand extended, ready to charm whoever held the clipboard. "Welcome. Welcome," Diane said warmly to Renee, completely ignoring my father and me standing a few feet back. "I run the HOA here and this storefront. Everything's in excellent condition, I assure you." Renee smiled politely and said, "I'm just here to assist. This is the property owner." Diane turned, finally registering my father, and her professional smile flickered for half a second in confusion before snapping back into place. "Of course. Wonderful to meet you," she said smoothly, extending her hand. My father shook it once, calmly. "Marcus Johnson," he said. Sterling Group. The name meant nothing to Diane in that instant. She processed it as simply a name, not yet the name on every lease document she'd ever signed. "Lovely to have you," she said, gesturing grandly toward her storefront. "Let me show you what makes Whitfield and Company special." As she turned to lead the way inside, her eyes finally landed on me, standing quietly beside my father. Recognition hit her like a physical jolt. The girl from the bag search. The girl she'd twice accused of theft. Standing there beside the man she'd just called wonderful to have. Her smile didn't fully disappear, but it went brittle, stretched thin over something scrambling underneath. "This is?" she asked, voice noticeably tighter than before. "Yes," my father said simply, watching her closely now, giving nothing away.
"She mentioned visiting your store a few..."
Diane's mind was clearly racing, recalculating everything in real time: the bag check, the accusation, the public ejection, all replaying against the sudden, horrifying knowledge of exactly whose daughter she'd humiliated twice. "How wonderful," she managed, voice thinner now. "Small world." Renee, unaware of any history, continued reviewing paperwork aloud. Lease terms, upcoming renewal dates, a note about 2 previous late payments requiring review. Diane barely registered the words, still visibly rattled, glancing between my father and me like she was trying to solve an equation that refused to balance. My father let the silence stretch a moment longer than comfortable before speaking again, tone even and unhurried. "I actually wanted to walk through personally today," he said, "because I'd heard some interesting things about how customers get treated here." Diane's composure cracked visibly for the first time. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," Diane said quickly. Too quickly. My father simply nodded, non-committal, and asked Renee to continue the walkthrough as planned. He wasn't ready to escalate yet. Not publicly, not without giving Diane one more chance to reveal exactly who she really was. The walkthrough continued for another 20 minutes. Diane narrating every shelf and display with forced enthusiasm, her voice climbing an octave higher than usual. My father asked polite, ordinary questions about foot traffic and inventory, giving no hint of the storm quietly gathering behind his calm expression. Before leaving, my father shook Diane's hand once more. "I'll be in touch soon about the lease renewal," he said simply. Diane's hand trembled slightly in his. "Of course. Anytime," she said, smile now frozen in place like a mask she couldn't quite remove. We walked out without another word. In the car, I finally let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for weeks. "She recognized me," I said. My father nodded. "What she'd done," he corrected gently. "Now she gets to sit with that for a while before anything happens. That's not mercy." For the next several days, Brookstone felt eerily calm, the surface-level quiet of a pond right before something breaks through it. Diane didn't call another HOA meeting. She didn't appear at the plaza as often. Neighbors whispered that she'd been acting strange, distracted, uncharacteristically quiet at drop-off and pick-up times. My mother, still gathering the growing file of neighbor complaints, decided this pause was the perfect moment to formally request an HOA board review. Not accusing Diane outright yet, simply asking, calmly, for a review of recent enforcement patterns under the new conduct policy she'd pushed through. Diane, sensing the request as a direct threat despite its polite wording, responded defensively at the next scheduled meeting, insisting any concerns be submitted through her office first, as HOA president, before reaching the full board. It was a transparent attempt to control the narrative before it spread further. "Louise, emboldened now by growing numbers of quietly frustrated neighbors, stood up during open comments and said simply, "Maybe it's time someone other than Diane reviewed complaints about Diane." The room went silent. Then a few uncomfortable, awkward chuckles rippled through, the sound of people finally sensing a shift. Diane's face flushed red, though she recovered quickly, insisting the suggestion was unnecessary and disruptive. But something had cracked open publicly for the first time: doubt, spoken aloud, in front of witnesses, instead of whispered privately over fences and driveways. Control, once total, doesn't survive its first visible crack. That night, Diane reportedly called an emergency private meeting with two loyal board members, Gerald and Patricia, both of whom owed their board seats largely to her endorsement over the years. According to Louise's source, Diane framed the growing complaints as an organized attack rather than legitimate grievances. Gerald and Patricia, ever loyal, agreed to help manage the narrative, quietly discouraging other residents from formally joining any complaint process. It was a small, desperate move, the kind people make when they sense their power slipping but haven't yet accepted how far it's already slipped. Meanwhile, my father received formal notice from Sterling Group's legal department. Diane's boutique lease was indeed due for renewal in 6 weeks, and per company policy, any tenant with repeated payment delinquencies and unresolved customer complaints required additional review before automatic renewal. The timing, admittedly, was almost poetic. He didn't rush the process, though. My father believed thoroughness mattered more than speed, that if consequences came for Diane, they needed to be airtight, undeniable, impossible to spin as personal revenge rather than legitimate accountability. He instructed Renee to formally document every complaint filed against the store. Renee's team began quietly interviewing former customers listed in complaint records, cross-referencing dates against my mother's growing neighbor file without either party realizing they were building the exact same case from two different directions. The evidence, unknown to Diane, was converging from both sides of her life at once. For a brief stretch, life at Brookstone felt almost normal again. Caleb rode his bike freely. My mother chatted with Louise over the fence. I even walked past the plaza without my stomach tightening. It was the deceptive calm before Diane, cornered and desperate, decided to fight rather than reflect. The break came from an unexpected direction. A new family moved into Brookstone, the Odomwingies, from Nigeria, buying one of the community's larger homes near the entrance gate. Within days, Diane had already stopped Mr. Odemwingie twice at the gate, questioning whether he actually lived here despite his resident sticker. Mrs., a physician working long hospital shifts, came home one evening to find a citation taped to her door for unauthorized vehicle, meaning her own car, parked in her own driveway, simply because Diane hadn't personally verified the new family's paperwork fast enough for her own comfort. My mother, hearing about this through Louise almost immediately, drove straight over to introduce herself and offer support. The Odomwingies, exhausted and bewildered, admitted they'd almost regretted buying the house after just 1 week of Diane's scrutiny. My mother assured them they weren't alone, and meant it completely. That week, Diane escalated further, sending a formal HOA letter to the Odomwingies citing multiple bylaw violations, including one absurd claim about their doormat exceeding acceptable size regulations. It read less like policy enforcement and more like a woman flailing to reassert control she felt slipping through her fingers. My mother added the Odemwingie complaint immediately to her file, now 8 families deep, spanning nearly 2 years of documented incidents. She began drafting, carefully and without emotion, a formal written request for an independent HOA review board, separate entirely from Diane's office, as current bylaws technically allowed. Diane, apparently sensing the walls closing in from multiple directions, doubled down instead of stepping back. She called an unscheduled HOA meeting, framing it as an open forum on neighborhood values, clearly hoping to rally sympathetic longtime residents before any formal complaints could gain real momentum against her. The meeting drew a larger crowd than usual, word having spread quietly through the neighborhood grapevine. Diane opened with a speech about protecting what makes Brookstone special, a phrase everyone understood, without her saying it outright, to mean keeping the community exactly as homogeneous as it had always been. Louise stood again, calmer this time, and asked directly, "Diane, can you explain the pattern of complaints specifically involving Black and immigrant families over the past 2 years?" The room went utterly silent. Diane's carefully composed expression faltered for just a second before she recovered with practiced indignation. "That's an outrageous and frankly offensive accusation," Diane said sharply, though her voice cracked slightly on offensive. Gerald, loyal as ever, quickly interjected, praising Diane's years of dedicated service, to redirect the room's attention. But several residents were already exchanging glances, quietly recalculating everything they'd previously excused or ignored. My mother, sitting near the back, calmly raised her hand when called on. "I have a formal written request here," she said, asking the board to establish an independent review process for enforcement complaints, separate from the HOA president's office. She placed the document directly on the table. Diane's face went pale, then flushed red in rapid succession. "This is completely unnecessary," she said, voice rising slightly. "I've served this community faithfully for 11 years. My mother replied evenly, "Then an independent review should be easy to pass, shouldn't it?" The silence that followed felt enormous. Patricia, visibly uncomfortable now, suggested tabling the discussion for further consideration, a classic delay tactic. But Louise pushed back immediately. "We've been considering this quietly for 2 years while families got hurt. I'd like a vote tonight." Several previously silent residents nodded in visible agreement for the first time. The board, caught off guard by the sudden shift in room energy, called for an actual vote on establishing the independent review committee. Passed 7-2. Diane and Gerald the only dissenting votes. It was the first time in 11 years the board had overruled her on anything at all. Diane sat frozen for a moment, the reality of losing control finally settling in publicly, in front of the same neighbors she'd spent over a decade managing and manipulating. She left the meeting immediately after, not waiting for adjournment, her heels echoing sharply across the community center's tile floor. That night, according to Louise's source on the board, Diane called Gerald in a panic, insisting the vote had been rigged by outside influence. She apparently didn't yet realize that the true outside influence wasn't a conspiracy. It was simply the accumulated weight of every family she'd quietly wronged, finally speaking up together. Meanwhile, my father's investigation had progressed further. Renee's team had uncovered something significant buried in the store's security system logs. Footage from the day Diane accused me of theft had been manually deleted less than an hour after the incident. An unusual and specific action for routine footage. Store security footage was typically retained automatically for 30 days unless someone manually intervened. Whoever deleted it had access only Diane possessed as store owner, and had done so suspiciously fast. Almost as if anticipating the footage might one day be requested by someone with actual authority to ask. My father requested Renee formally document this deletion timestamp against the store's access logs, building an unmistakable paper trail. It wasn't proof of malice exactly, but it was proof of consciousness, proof Diane had known, even in the moment, that the footage wouldn't have supported her version of events. Around this same time, Priya, the young employee Diane had repeatedly redirected during my visits, quietly reached out to my mother through Louise's network, saying she'd witnessed the entire bag check incident and had felt uncomfortable about it for weeks but was too afraid of losing her job to say anything. My mother met with Priya privately at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood, careful not to pressure her into anything she wasn't ready for. Priya explained that Diane routinely instructed staff to watch certain customers closely, a phrase everyone understood without needing further explanation of what it actually meant. Priya agreed, nervously but genuinely, to provide a written statement describing what she'd witnessed, on the condition her name wouldn't be used unless absolutely necessary. My mother promised to protect her as much as possible, understanding fully how much courage it took for an employee to speak against her own boss. With Priya's statement, the deleted footage, the deeper pattern across 8 families, and now a formal HOA review committee in motion, the case against Diane had grown far larger than one uncomfortable afternoon in a boutique. It had become undeniable evidence of a sustained pattern nobody could dismiss as coincidence anymore. Diane, unaware of exactly how much had been quietly assembled against her, made her next move out of pure panic rather than strategy. She began telling select neighbors that the Johnson family was trying to take over the neighborhood, painting my father as some kind of corporate villain rather than a landlord simply enforcing standard policy. This rumor reached us through an unlikely source, Gerald's own wife, who apparently disagreed with her husband's continued loyalty to Diane and quietly warned my mother what was being said behind our backs. My mother thanked her calmly, adding the detail to her file without reacting emotionally in the moment. My father, hearing the rumor, remained unbothered, almost amused by it. "Let her talk," he said. "The more she spins a story that isn't true, the easier it becomes to show everyone the actual truth later." He believed patience was the sharpest weapon available in situations like this one. Diane's desperation seemed to intensify daily. She began sending increasingly aggressive HOA notices to multiple families, not just the Odomwingies, citing minor, previously unenforced rules, trash bin placement, holiday light timing, even grass height measured to the exact inch. It read like a woman flailing to reassert dominance anywhere she still could. One notice, sent to an elderly widower named Mr. Thompson, cited his wheelchair ramp as aesthetically inconsistent with community standards, demanding its removal within 30 days. This particular notice, when it circulated through the neighborhood group chat, finally turned even longtime Diane supporters visibly, audibly against her. Mr. a retired Army veteran, brought the notice directly to the newly formed independent review committee, visibly shaken and humiliated. The committee, only weeks old, unanimously voided the citation on the spot, its first official act, and quietly began reviewing every other notice Diane had issued in recent memory. Word of the voided citation spread fast, emboldening other residents who'd quietly received similarly absurd notices over the years to finally come forward themselves. What had once felt like isolated bad luck now felt, collectively, like exactly what it was, a documented pattern of one woman's unchecked, escalating control. Diane, cornered from every direction now, made a decision that would prove to be her most damaging yet. She contacted a local news blogger known for neighborhood gossip, framing herself as the true victim, an HOA president being smeared by a wealthy developer family flexing power over a simple misunderstanding. The blogger, hungry for engagement, published a short piece implying I had caused a disturbance at Whitfield and Company, and that my family was retaliating disproportionately through corporate leverage. It painted Diane as principled and unfairly targeted, and painted me, without naming me directly, as some entitled troublemaker. Reading it felt like being punched all over again, this time publicly, anonymously, but unmistakably about me. My mother's hands shook slightly holding her phone, the first time I'd seen her genuinely rattled through this entire ordeal. She just made a very serious mistake, was all she said. My father read the article twice, expression unreadable, before calmly closing his laptop. She just gave us permission to stop being quiet, he said. Until now, he'd handled everything privately, methodically, giving Diane every chance to correct course on her own. That door, he decided, had officially just closed for good. He instructed Sterling Group's legal team to formally compile everything: the deleted footage timestamp, Priya's statement, the 8-family complaint file, the voided Thompson citation, and now the defamatory blog post itself, which conveniently repeated details only someone with inside knowledge of my private confrontation could have known. That detail mattered enormously. The blogger's post described specifics: the bag search, the loitering accusation that had never been made public anywhere except within our private family conversations, and Diane's own account to whoever fed the blogger this story. Confirmed, unmistakably, exactly who the source had been. My mother, meanwhile, reached out gently to Priya again, asking if she felt comfortable now speaking more formally, given how far things had escalated publicly. Priya, visibly frightened but resolute, agreed, saying she couldn't stay silent watching Diane target an entire family this openly and dishonestly in public. The Independent Review Committee, now fully active, requested Diane appear before them directly to answer questions about the mounting complaints, the voided citations, and specifically the pattern flagged by multiple families of color within the community. Diane, for the first time in 11 years, was being formally summoned rather than presiding. She initially refused, citing personal health reasons, a transparent stalling tactic everyone recognized immediately. The committee, unmoved, scheduled the hearing anyway for 2 weeks later, informing her that her continued refusal to appear would simply be noted formally in the committee's final report to the full membership. Diane's public composure, once flawless, was visibly crumbling now under real accountability for the first time in over a decade. Neighbors reported seeing her arguing loudly on her phone in her driveway, snapping at delivery drivers, even briefly abandoning a grocery cart mid-aisle after an awkward run-in with Mrs. Odemwingie. Gerald, sensing the tide had fully turned against his longtime ally, quietly resigned from the HOA board rather than face further scrutiny himself for years of enabling her behavior. His resignation letter, leaked briefly through the neighborhood chat, admitted vaguely to concerns about past decisions without specifying anything directly. Patricia followed shortly after, though far less gracefully, posting a lengthy, defensive statement online insisting she'd always tried to do the right thing, while conveniently omitting any specific mention of the citations she'd personally approved alongside Diane over the years. Nobody was particularly convinced by her sudden repositioning. With her closest allies gone, Diane stood almost entirely alone on the board for the first time, isolated by the very culture of unquestioned loyalty she'd spent over a decade carefully cultivating around herself. Power built entirely on fear and control, turned out, evaporated remarkably quickly once fear stopped working. 2 days before her scheduled hearing, Diane attempted one final, desperate maneuver, quietly offering the Odemwingies a goodwill gesture of waived HOA dues for a year, apparently hoping to secure their silence before the committee could hear their formal complaint firsthand. They declined immediately and reported the offer. That attempted bribe, reported directly to the review committee, transformed the entire situation from a pattern of poor judgment into something far more serious, a clear, documented attempt to obstruct an ongoing formal review process. Even her remaining supporters within the neighborhood struggled to defend that particular decision. My father, informed of the attempted bribe, finally decided the time had come to formally notify Diane of Sterling Group's lease review findings as well, separate entirely from the HOA process but converging on the exact same timeline. Both fronts of accountability were now closing in simultaneously. Unavoidably, he requested a formal meeting with Diane at Sterling Group's regional office. Not the plaza, not her territory this time, but neutral ground where she'd have no home field advantage of any kind. Renee scheduled it for the same week as her HOA committee hearing, deliberately, strategically compounding the pressure. I asked my father if I could attend that meeting too. He hesitated, clearly protective, before finally agreeing. "You've earned the right to see this through," he said. "But you don't owe her anything. Not anger. Not closure. Nothing. Whatever you feel in that room is entirely yours to decide." The night before the meeting, I barely slept, replaying every humiliating moment from the past 2 months, the bag search, the public ejection, Sophie's horrified face, the blog post calling me a troublemaker. I wasn't nervous about facing Diane anymore. I was simply, finally, ready to be done being afraid of her. The morning of the meeting arrived gray and quiet, fitting somehow for what felt like the closing chapter of something that had consumed our family's attention for weeks. My mother pressed my father's collar flat again, the same small ritual from the plaza walkthrough. This time, I understood exactly why. We arrived at Sterling Group's regional office 15 minutes early. Renee already waiting with a thick folder of documentation spread across the conference table. Timestamps, statements, citations, the blog post, everything assembled with meticulous, undeniable precision. My father sat at the head of the table, calm as still water. Diane arrived exactly on time, dressed sharply, clearly having rehearsed some version of composed professionalism for the occasion. Her expression flickered slightly upon seeing me seated beside my parents, But she recovered quickly, taking her seat with practiced poise, unaware of exactly how much evidence awaited her across that table. "Thank you for meeting with me," my father began evenly, sliding the folder gently across the table toward her. "I wanted to discuss your lease renewal and some concerns that have come to our attention regarding customer treatment at your store."
Diane's composed expression cracked.
She opened the folder slowly, and her face changed with each page: the deleted footage timestamp, Priya's signed statement, the neighbor complaint summary spanning 8 families, the voided citations, and finally, the blog post itself, highlighted where its details matched only information known privately within my family. "This is completely misrepresented," Diane said, voice tight, flipping pages faster now, visibly searching for an angle to argue from. "I run a business. I have to be cautious about theft. That's simply prudent management." My father let her finish completely before responding, his voice calm but absolutely unwavering now. "Diane, the footage from the day you accused my daughter of theft was deleted within an hour of the incident," he said. "Deliberately, by someone with your exact level of system access. That's not caution." Diane's face went pale, her carefully constructed narrative visibly collapsing in real time. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, though her voice had lost its earlier confidence entirely. My father continued, unhurried. "I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you what the timestamps show. And I'm telling you that 8 separate families have documented remarkably similar experiences with you over 2 years." Diane's hands trembled slightly against the folder now, all pretense of control finally abandoning her completely. "You're trying to destroy my business over a misunderstanding," she said, voice cracking audibly. "No," my father said, firm but not unkind. "You did that yourself, incident by incident, for years before I ever walked in." She turned to me directly for the first time, something desperate flickering across her expression. "I didn't know who you were," she said, as though that somehow excused everything. I felt something in my chest loosen finally, the fear I'd carried for weeks replaced entirely by clear, steady resolve. "That's exactly the problem," I said quietly. "You shouldn't need to know who someone's father is to treat them decently. You decided I didn't belong before you knew anything about me at all twice." The room went completely silent, Diane visibly absorbing the full weight of that sentence. My father let the silence sit a moment before continuing, his tone shifting into something more formal, more final. "Sterling Group will not be renewing your lease at the end of this quarter," he said plainly. "The decision is based on documented payment delinquencies and unresolved customer complaints, effective immediately upon notice." Diane's composure fully collapsed then, tears welling despite her obvious effort to hold them back. 11 years, she said, mostly to herself. 11 years building that store. My father's expression softened slightly, not with sympathy exactly, but with something quieter, more measured.
"And how many people did—"
She didn't answer that question, because there wasn't really an answer that helped her. She simply gathered the folder with shaking hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes now, and left the conference room without another word, her heels echoing down the hallway just as they had in the community center weeks earlier. I expected to feel triumphant walking out of that room. Instead, I mostly felt tired. The specific exhaustion of finally setting down something heavy I hadn't even fully realized I'd been carrying for 2 months. My mother squeezed my hand once in the elevator, understanding exactly what that particular silence meant. But the story wasn't quite finished yet. Diane, humiliated and cornered on 2 fronts simultaneously, still had her HOA hearing scheduled for 2 days later. And desperation, I was learning, rarely goes quietly into any good night without one final, reckless attempt to reclaim lost ground. The night before her hearing, according to what Louise later pieced together, Diane drove to the Odemwingie house late in the evening, apparently intending some kind of last-ditch conversation to convince them to withdraw their formal complaint before the committee could hear it directly the following day. Mrs. Alone with her children while her husband worked a late hospital shift, felt genuinely frightened by the unannounced late-night visit and called neighborhood security immediately rather than answering the door. Diane, apparently, hadn't considered how a stranger's unexpected nighttime visit might actually feel from the other side. Security arrived to find Diane still standing on the porch, insisting loudly she just wanted to talk, refusing initially to leave despite Mrs. Odemwingie's clear distress from behind the locked door. It took a second call and a supervisor's direct instruction before Diane finally, reluctantly, returned to her own home. The incident report, filed automatically by neighborhood security, landed directly on the HOA review committee's desk the very next morning, hours before Diane's scheduled hearing. It was, unintentionally, the single most damaging piece of evidence she could have possibly generated against herself at the worst possible moment. By the time Diane arrived for her hearing that afternoon, the committee members had already read the security report in full, their expressions notably harder, more resolved than they might have been otherwise. Diane, seemingly unaware of how badly the previous night's decision had compounded everything else against her, sat down calmly. The hearing opened with the committee reviewing the accumulated complaint file, 8 families, the deleted footage, Priya's statement, the voided citations, and now the security report from the night before, all laid out in careful, methodical sequence for the full committee and several observing residents to witness directly. Diane attempted her earlier defense again, insisting she'd simply been protective of community standards. But her voice lacked its usual commanding certainty now, thinner, more brittle with each passing question from committee members who no longer felt obligated to defer to her the way they once automatically had. Priya, present in person this time, calmly confirmed her written statement aloud, describing specifically how Diane had instructed staff to monitor certain customers more closely, based purely on appearance, with no connection whatsoever to any actual suspicious behavior. Diane visibly flinched, unable to meet her former employee's steady gaze. Louise then read a summary of all 8 family complaints aloud, name by name, incident by incident, the accumulated pattern finally spoken plainly in a public setting rather than whispered privately over fences for years. The room's silence afterward felt heavier than any argument could have possibly achieved. When finally given the floor to respond fully, Diane's voice cracked almost immediately. "I built this community," she said. "I kept standards high. Maybe I made mistakes. But everything I did was to protect what we built here together." Nobody in the room seemed to share her version of together anymore. The committee deliberated only briefly before returning with their decision. Diane Whitfield was formally removed from the HOA presidency. effective immediately, and permanently barred from holding any future board position within Brookstone Estates. The vote, unlike every decision in the past 11 years, was entirely unanimous. Diane sat frozen for a long moment, absorbing the finality of it completely, before standing slowly and walking out without a word, the community center door closing softly behind her instead of slamming, somehow making the silence that followed feel even louder than any dramatic exit could have. Within a week, word spread that Diane had listed her home for sale. Quietly, without any announcement or farewell to the neighborhood she'd spent 11 years controlling so tightly. Some residents felt a flicker of pity watching her packing boxes alone in her driveway. Most simply felt relief that a long chapter had finally closed. Whitfield and Company. At the end of the month, the lease formally terminated. The space eventually leased to a small family-owned bakery, run by a couple who'd moved to Brookstone specifically because the neighborhood's reputation, ironically, was finally beginning to genuinely change for the better. I walked past that storefront often in the weeks after, watching the new bakery's warm yellow awning slowly replace Diane's cold, polished signage. Felt less like victory and more like relief, the quiet kind that settles in after something heavy has finally, actually lifted off your shoulders. My mother continued working with the newly independent review committee, helping formalize clearer, fairer enforcement guidelines for the entire community, ones that couldn't be selectively applied based on someone's private, unspoken judgments about who did or didn't belong in the neighborhood they'd all chosen to call home. The Odomwingies, finally able to settle into their new home without constant scrutiny, hosted a small neighborhood gathering that fall, one nobody measured for excessive cars or driveway violations. Mrs. my mother personally, saying she finally felt like Brookstone might actually become the fresh start they'd hoped for. Mr. ramp remained exactly where it had always been, untouched. Its aesthetic inconsistency, apparently no longer a pressing community concern once the person measuring inconsistency had lost every bit of authority to measure anything at all anymore. Priya found a new job at a boutique 2 towns over, one where, she told my mother later, the owner actually trusted her judgment about customers instead of hovering suspiciously over every interaction. She still thinks often, she admitted, about how long she stayed silent before finally speaking up. Sophie apologized to me weeks later for not immediately backing me up during that second confrontation, admitting she'd frozen from shock rather than doubt. I told her honestly that I understood completely. It's genuinely hard to know how to react the first time you witness that kind of injustice firsthand. Gerald, having resigned before the hearing, largely disappeared from neighborhood social life entirely, occasionally spotted mowing his lawn in silence, never quite making eye contact with neighbors who'd once treated his opinion as nearly equal to Diane's own considerable authority within the community. Patricia attempted briefly to run for an open board seat the following spring, but lost badly, most residents no longer willing to extend automatic trust to anyone who'd spent years quietly enabling the very patterns the community was still actively working hard to repair and move past. Louise became something of an unofficial community historian after everything settled, gently reminding newer residents, whenever old habits threatened to resurface, exactly what had happened and exactly why the new, fairer review process mattered so much for absolutely everyone living there now. My father, true to his usual quiet style, never publicly discussed the lease decision or the reasoning behind it, letting the paperwork and the timeline speak entirely for themselves. He believed loudly announcing consequences cheapened them somehow. Better, he always said, to simply let actions carry their own natural weight. My mother's shared complaint file, once informal and quietly assembled, eventually became the actual template Brookstone's new committee adopted for tracking future enforcement patterns, ensuring no single person could ever again wield unchecked authority over who felt welcome and who didn't within their own paid-for community. Caleb, blissfully unaware of most of the adult complexity swirling around him throughout, simply resumed riding his bike to the ice cream shop with Jordan and Miles. Every single weekend, delighted that nobody stopped him anymore, never fully grasping how much had actually changed to make that simple freedom possible again. I finally returned to the plaza myself one Saturday afternoon, this time to the new bakery, ordering a cinnamon roll from the friendly new owner who greeted every customer, regardless of appearance, with the exact same warm, unhurried smile. Felt like such a small thing. It genuinely wasn't. Sitting there by the window, cinnamon roll in hand, I thought back to that very first bag search. How small and humiliated I'd felt standing in that exact spot months earlier. The space looked completely different now, though the walls themselves, of course, hadn't physically changed at all. What had changed was everything underneath the surface: who held power, who got believed, who got to decide, quietly or loudly, whether someone belonged somewhere. That kind of change, I was learning, rarely happens in one dramatic moment. It happens slowly, then all at once, when enough people finally speak. My mother often reminded me, in the months that followed, that none of it would have unfolded the way it did without Priya's courage, Louise's persistence, Mrs. Odemwingi's willingness to file a complaint, and 8 separate families finally trusting each other enough to compare their quietly carried, individually doubted experiences. Diane didn't fall because of one bag search, my mother said one evening. She fell because she spent 11 years assuming nobody would ever add it all up. That idea stuck with me long after. How unchecked small cruelties, left unexamined, eventually accumulate into something impossible to ignore. I heard, secondhand through Louise, that Diane had moved 2 states away, taking a quiet administrative job entirely unrelated to retail or community management. Nobody in Brookstone seemed to know or particularly care what she was doing now. Her chapter there had simply, completely, closed. My father, reflecting once during a quiet family dinner, said something I've held onto since. Power reveals people, he said. Diane wasn't cruel because she suddenly changed. She was always capable of it. She just never expected anyone with enough standing to actually hold her accountable for it before. I asked him if he felt any guilt about the lease decision, given how personal it had ultimately become for our family specifically. He shook his head firmly. The decision was based entirely on the documented pattern, he said.
Your situation just happened to finally...
That distinction mattered enormously to me. Actually, this was never really about revenge for one humiliating afternoon. It was about a pattern finally becoming visible enough, undeniable enough, that people with actual authority to intervene could no longer reasonably look away from it any longer. As the school year continued, I found myself thinking less about Diane specifically and more about the quieter lesson underneath everything: how easily unchecked authority, Even something as small as running a homeowners association can curdle into a private, unaccountable kingdom if nobody ever bothers questioning it directly. Brookstone itself felt different that winter. Lighter somehow. Neighbors greeting each other with less caution. Less unspoken calculation about who belonged and who might report them for some invented violation. Small talk at the mailboxes returned. The ordinary, unremarkable texture of an actual functioning community. The new bakery owners, the Ferreras, became close with my mother over the following months, occasionally sharing that longtime residents still stopped by just to say how different the plaza felt now. Warmer, less watched, less like walking through a space someone else silently controlled and judged. I eventually wrote a short reflection for my senior year college application essay about the whole experience, though I changed enough details to keep things private. Writing it helped me understand something I hadn't fully processed yet, how much quiet or courage it takes to simply stand still and ask for accountability. My guidance counselor, reading an early draft, asked gently if the experience had made me distrustful of people in positions of authority generally. I told her honestly that it hadn't. It had actually made me trust, more specifically, the people willing to use their authority carefully and fairly instead. Priya reached out once more that spring, thanking my mother for believing her account without hesitation from the very beginning, saying it had given her the confidence to speak up again recently when she noticed something similarly unfair happening at her new job. Courage, apparently, tends to spread once modeled clearly. Mrs. invited our family over for dinner that spring. A warm, generous Nigerian meal that stretched for hours, full of easy laughter neither family had expected to share given how tense their first months in Brookstone had genuinely been because of everything Diane had put them through. Caleb and the Odemwingi's youngest son became fast friends that year, riding bikes together freely through streets that finally actually felt like theirs to enjoy without constant, invisible scrutiny hanging over every small, ordinary childhood moment they were simply trying to have. Louise, still quietly serving on the new review committee, once told my mother that the entire experience had taught her something important about her own past silence. I saw things for years, she admitted.
I just never thought it was my place to say anything.
That admission stayed with me too. How often people witness injustice quietly, assuming someone else, someone with more standing or less to lose, will eventually be the one to speak up first. Sometimes, I learned that someone simply has to be whoever notices it clearly enough to finally act. By early summer, Brookstone held its first community picnic under the new committee's guidelines, an event genuinely open to everyone, without Diane's old, quietly enforced hierarchy of who received warm greetings and who received suspicious, watchful glances instead throughout the entire afternoon. I stood near the picnic tables watching Caleb race Jordan and Miles across the open lawn, the Odemwingi family laughing easily with the Ferreras near the dessert table, Mr. Thompson proudly showing off his still-standing wheelchair ramp to anyone who'd listen, and felt something settle fully inside my chest. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than that, the simple, ordinary relief of watching a community slowly learn how to actually welcome people instead of merely tolerating them under someone else's narrow, unspoken conditions for belonging. My mother, watching the same scene beside me, said quietly, "This is what it's supposed to look like." I didn't need to ask what she meant. After everything, the answer was standing right there in front of us. laughing, eating, existing freely, exactly as it always should have been from the start. My father joined us eventually, plate in hand, watching the same lawn full of neighbors who'd once whispered nervously about corporate retaliation, now simply enjoying a Saturday together without a second thought about who was supposedly in charge of deciding whether they belonged there at all. "You did good," he told me quietly, watching me watch the picnic. I hadn't done anything particularly dramatic myself. Really, I'd simply refused to shrink, refused to accept humiliation as something I owed an explanation for. Sometimes, apparently, that alone is enough to start something much larger moving. Looking back now, I understand the entire experience differently than I did living through it moment by moment. At the time, felt like an endless, exhausting series of small humiliations and slow-building tension. From this distance, it reads clearly as something else entirely. Accountability, finally, simply arriving. Diane never publicly apologized. Not to me, not to the Odomwingies, not to Priya, not to any of the 8 families whose complaints eventually built the case against her. Some people, I've learned, never fully accept responsibility even when consequences arrive undeniably, precisely, directly at their own front door. That used to bother me more than it does now. I've come to understand that accountability doesn't actually require someone's genuine remorse to matter. It simply requires that the pattern stops, that the harm ends, that the next family walking into that plaza never experiences what I did. The bakery still operates today, warm and unremarkable in the best possible way. Exactly the kind of ordinary, welcoming storefront every neighborhood plaza should probably have from the very beginning, long before anyone ever needs a CEO's daughter to accidentally walk through its doors to make that happen. Brookstone's new review committee remains active, still chaired by Louise, still carefully documenting any pattern of selective enforcement before it can ever again quietly calcify into something as entrenched and unquestioned as Diane's 11-year reign had somehow become before anyone finally pushed back hard enough. My father was eventually asked, informally, whether Sterling Group would consider taking a more active role in Brookstone's governance going forward, given everything that had happened. He declined politely, saying communities function best when their own residents hold each other accountable, not when an outside company simply steps in to fix things. "We can enforce a lease," he told the board president who'd asked. "We can't enforce decency. That has to come from you, collectively, choosing it every single day, especially when nobody with any real power happens to be watching closely at that exact moment." I think about that distinction often now. In college, in new towns, meeting new people who have no idea any of this ever happened to me at all. Decency isn't something anyone can legislate perfectly into existence. It has to be chosen, repeatedly, by ordinary people, in ordinary, unremarkable moments. Sophie and I remained close friends through graduation, and she still occasionally brings up that day in the boutique, admitting it fundamentally changed how she thinks about staying silent when she witnesses something unfair happening to someone else standing right beside her. Priya eventually became an assistant manager at her new store, and reached out once more to tell my mother, proudly, that she'd implemented clear, written guidelines specifically designed to prevent any single employee from ever again being unfairly profiled or watched based purely on appearance rather than actual behavior. Mrs. completed her hospital residency that year and now mentors younger physicians, occasionally telling them, when relevant, about her own family's early struggles adjusting to a new community, and how much difference it makes when neighbors actually choose to show up for each other instead of merely watching quietly. Mr. Way peacefully 2 years later, his ramp still standing exactly where he'd built it, a small, permanent, physical reminder of the moment. An entire community finally decided that one person's narrow, invented definition of acceptable no longer got to determine everyone else's basic dignity. I attended his memorial, along with most of Brookstone, and heard multiple neighbors quietly reference the year everything changed here, without needing to specify exactly what they meant. Everyone in that room already understood completely, having lived through some version of it themselves, directly or as a witness. Caleb, now a teenager himself, barely remembers any of it clearly anymore, which honestly feels like its own kind of quiet victory, that the specific fear and tension of that period simply never became part of his own lasting memory of growing up in that particular neighborhood. I do remember it, clearly, completely, and I've come to see that as valuable rather than burdensome. Remembering keeps me watchful, in the best sense, aware of how easily small unchecked cruelties can accumulate quietly for years if nobody with enough standing or courage finally chooses to name them plainly. My mother still keeps a version of that original complaint file, updated occasionally, not out of lingering resentment toward Diane specifically, but as a working template she's since shared with 2 other communities dealing with strikingly similar patterns of one person's unchecked, long unquestioned authority. Every neighborhood has a Diane somewhere, she told me once. Not unkindly, more as simple observation. The question is always whether enough people are willing to compare notes before it's allowed to go on for 11 years instead of 11 weeks. I've never forgotten that particular phrasing. One afternoon that final summer before college, I ran into Diane completely unexpectedly at an airport 2 states away, both of us waiting for delayed flights in the same crowded gate area. She looked smaller somehow, older, dressed plainly, nothing like the sharp, commanding presence I remembered from Whitfield and Company. She recognized me instantly, her expression flickering through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise, then something like shame, then a kind of tired, resigned acknowledgement. For a long moment, neither of us said anything at all, the airport noise filling the space where words might have gone instead. Amara, she finally said. My actual name, something she'd never once used during any of our previous encounters. I owe you an apology I should have given a long time ago. I hadn't expected that. Honestly, not after everything. Not after all this time apart with no contact whatsoever. I told myself for a long time it wasn't really about you specifically, she continued, voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. But it was. My store before I ever actually looked at who you were. That was wrong. And I knew it, even then. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that, the way I might have imagined feeling months earlier during the worst of it. Mostly I just felt a kind of tired, complicated relief, the sense of something finally, fully completing itself after being left open and unresolved for far too long. Thank you for saying that, I told her simply, meaning it, though not offering forgiveness exactly, because that wasn't really mine to give in any complete sense. And she hadn't asked for it directly anyway. Some acknowledgments just need to exist plainly, without requiring anything further in return. I lost everything I thought mattered, she said, mostly to herself now, staring past me toward the gate monitors. Turns out none of it actually mattered the way I thought it did. Just people. Decently when nobody else was specifically watching you do it. Our flights were called separately not long after, and we simply nodded, a small, quiet acknowledgement of everything unsaid between us, before walking in opposite directions through the terminal. I never saw or heard from Diane Whitfield again after that single, unexpected airport conversation. I've thought about that encounter often since, though. It didn't erase anything that happened, didn't undo any of the humiliation or fear from those months at Brookstone. But it did confirm something I'd started believing anyway, that consequences, real ones, eventually teach lessons that flattery and unchecked power never quite managed to. Starting college that fall felt like stepping fully into a life no longer shadowed by any of it. Though the experience had genuinely shaped how I moved through new spaces, a little more watchful, a little quicker to notice when someone else was being subtly, unfairly singled out around me. I joined a campus organization focused on tenant and consumer rights almost immediately, drawn to it specifically because of everything I'd witnessed and experienced firsthand at Brookstone. It felt less like activism and more like simply continuing a lesson I'd already learned the hard, personal way. My roommate, Devin, asked once why I cared so specifically about documentation and formal complaint processes when discussing campus housing issues. I told him a shortened version of the story, and he simply said, "That's exactly why people need paper trails. Feelings get argued with. Dates and records don't." That phrase stuck with me, echoing something my mother had instinctively understood from the very beginning of everything, that quiet, patient documentation, more than any single dramatic confrontation, is often what actually dismantles unchecked authority in the end. Brick by careful, undeniable brick. My father, visiting campus that first semester, asked how I was settling in, and eventually the conversation drifted back toward everything that had happened at Brookstone the year before. "Do you regret how we handled it?" he asked, genuinely curious rather than defensive about the question. I told him honestly that I didn't. Not the patience, not the careful documentation, not even the uncomfortable waiting while consequences slowly assembled themselves properly instead of arriving in some quick, dramatic burst of anger. "It felt right," I said, "because it was actually about more than just me." He nodded, seeming satisfied by that answer specifically. "That's usually how you know it's the right kind of consequence," he said. "When it ends up protecting people who never even knew your name, instead of just settling one single, personal score for yourself alone." I still think about Priya sometimes, wondering how her career has continued unfolding, hoping she's found workplaces that actually deserve her honesty and courage. I think about Mrs. Presidents. Learning from a woman who once felt unwelcome in her own driveway, now teaching others how to show up fully for people. I think about Mr. still standing somewhere in my memory even after his passing. A small physical monument to the exact moment an entire neighborhood finally decided one person's narrow definition of acceptable didn't get to override everyone else's basic, ordinary dignity anymore. Mostly, though, I think about that very first afternoon, standing frozen near the register while Diane accused me of theft in front of strangers. How small and powerless I felt in that specific moment, completely unaware of everything quietly beginning to shift in motion because of it. I couldn't have known then how far it would travel, from one uncomfortable bag search to an entire community rebuilding how it decided who belonged and who didn't. Sometimes the biggest changes really do start in the smallest, most humiliating, most easily overlooked moments imaginable. Looking back, I'm genuinely grateful my parents chose patience over immediate anger, documentation over impulsive confrontation, and fairness over simple, personal revenge. It would have been easier, in some ways, to just have my father fire off an angry letter that very first week and call it settled. Instead, they let the pattern reveal itself fully and let consequences arrive only once they were airtight, undeniable, impossible for anyone to dismiss as retaliation instead of legitimate accountability. That patience, more than any single dramatic confrontation, is ultimately what changed an entire community for good. Brookstone today looks, on the surface, almost identical to how it looked before any of this happened. Same houses, same plaza, same quiet, tree-lined streets. But underneath that familiar surface, something fundamental actually changed. Something you can feel in how neighbors now greet each other without hesitation or calculation. I visited over winter break my sophomore year, walking the same streets I'd once quietly avoided, and felt nothing but ordinary comfort this time. The plaza bustled with families of every background, the bakery's warm smell drifting out into the parking lot, nobody watching anyone else with suspicion. Louise, still on the review committee years later, updated me on how things had continued evolving, new families welcomed without incident, the old absurd bylaws quietly rewritten into something fairer and more consistently applied to absolutely everyone living there, regardless of who they happened to be. We finally got it right, she told me, or at least closer to right than we'd ever managed before. I told her I thought that was probably the most anyone could reasonably hope for. Not perfection, but genuine, continuous, deliberate effort toward something fairer than what existed previously. My mother, reflecting once during a quiet conversation, told me she'd learned something important from the entire experience too. I used to think staying quiet was the safest choice, she said. I learned it's actually the most dangerous one, for everyone else who comes after you specifically. That lesson has shaped how I move through the world since, in ways both small and significant. I speak up now, quickly, clearly, whenever I witness something unfair happening to someone else, understanding fully how much silence, even well-intentioned silence, can quietly allow harm to continue accumulating unchecked. My father's approach, patient, methodical, evidence-based, taught me something equally important about how real accountability actually works best in practice. Anger alone rarely changes systems. Documented, undeniable patterns, presented calmly and completely, tend to succeed where pure emotion alone consistently falls short. I carry both lessons together now, understanding they're not actually contradictory at all. Speak up quickly when you witness harm. Build your case patiently and carefully when real consequences are actually possible. Know clearly which moment calls for which particular approach, and trust yourself enough to choose correctly. Diane Whitfield taught me, unintentionally, one of the most valuable lessons of my life, though not remotely the one she ever intended to teach anyone. She taught me that unchecked power, left unquestioned long enough, will always eventually reveal its true, ugly shape to anyone patient enough to keep watching closely. She also taught me that consequences, when they finally arrive properly, rarely feel like the dramatic, satisfying moment you might imagine while living through the original humiliation itself. They feel quieter than that, more like relief slowly settling in, more like simply exhaling after holding your breath for far too long. I don't know exactly where Diane is today, and honestly, I've stopped wondering much about it at all. Her story, whatever it's become since that brief airport conversation, isn't really mine to carry forward or worry over any further. My story continued moving forward. Without her, a long time ago now, what I carry forward instead is everything Brookstone taught me collectively. Priya's quiet courage, Louise's persistence, my mother's patient documentation, my father's methodical fairness, and the simple, powerful realization that unfair patterns only survive as long as nobody bothers comparing notes clearly enough to see them plainly. I graduated college eventually with a degree focused on public policy, drawn specifically toward housing and consumer protection work. Understanding fully now how much difference clear, fair, consistently enforced rules can make in whether ordinary people feel genuinely welcome somewhere, or merely tolerated under someone else's narrow, unspoken conditions. My first job out of college involved reviewing exactly the kind of tenant and resident complaints I'd once helped my own family document informally years earlier. It felt less like coincidence and more like simply continuing something that had started, unknowingly, that very first humiliating afternoon at Whitfield and Company. I think Diane would probably be surprised, honestly, to learn how directly her actions shaped my entire career path. How something she intended as a small, cruel assertion of control over one teenage girl instead became the exact foundation for a lifetime's worth of caring deeply about fairness. My mother still tells the story occasionally at family gatherings, always ending it the same specific way. Never underestimate how much one quiet, patient, documented pattern can eventually accomplish, especially once enough people finally trust each other enough to actually compare notes out loud together. My father, less inclined toward storytelling generally, simply nods along whenever she tells it, occasionally adding his own single, quiet observation at the very end. Power reveals people. Give it enough time, and it always eventually shows you exactly who someone really is underneath everything else. Caleb, now nearly finished with his own high school years, still rides his bike freely through Brookstone streets whenever he visits our old neighborhood, utterly unaware of exactly how much quiet, patient, deliberate effort went into making that simple, ordinary freedom something he never had to think twice about at all. I think that's probably the truest measure of everything that changed. Not the dramatic hearing. Not the lease termination. Not even Diane's unexpected airport apology. But simply a 10-year-old boy riding his bike to get ice cream without anyone ever stopping him again for existing exactly where he belonged. Sometimes genuine justice looks less like a courtroom drama and more like an ordinary Saturday afternoon nobody has to think twice about anymore. Sometimes it looks like a bakery's warm smell replacing a cold storefront's suspicious watching. Sometimes it simply looks like quiet, boring, hard-won normalcy finally returning. I used to think stories like this needed a dramatic, satisfying final confrontation to feel complete. Some grand moment of comeuppance delivered perfectly on camera. Living through it taught me something quieter and truer instead. Real justice mostly looks like patient, undeniable consequences, arriving calmly, exactly when they're finally due. Brookstone Estates continues on today, an ordinary suburban community like countless others across the country. This plaza bustling, the streets quiet, its review committee still quietly, carefully doing its unglamorous, essential work of making sure no single person ever again controls who feels welcome there. I visit occasionally still, less often now that I've built my own life elsewhere, but always with the same quiet sense of relief walking those familiar streets. The plaza, the bakery, Mr. Thompson's still standing ramp, now maintained by whoever bought his house. A small, permanent monument nobody thought to remove. My mother's original complaint file, the one she started so carefully and quietly all those years ago, still exists somewhere in a folder on her computer. A strange, unglamorous artifact of exactly how much patient, careful documentation it actually took to finally dismantle one person's decade of unchecked control. I asked her once if she ever felt vindicated seeing everything finally resolve the way it did. She considered the question seriously before answering. Not vindicated exactly, she said. More just, us finally trusted each other enough to compare our stories honestly before it went on any longer. That answer has stayed with me clearly, maybe more than anything else from the entire experience. It wasn't really about revenge, or triumph, or even accountability for its own sake alone. It was simply about enough people finally, collectively, refusing to accept something quietly unfair as somehow normal any longer. Diane Whitfield spent 11 years building a small, unquestioned kingdom out of a homeowners association and a boutique storefront, deciding quietly who belonged and who didn't, confident nobody with enough standing would ever bother adding up the pattern clearly enough to actually challenge her directly. She was wrong. Eventually, though it took far longer than it probably should have, 8 families, 1 deleted security recording, 1 brave employee's statement, 1 voided citation for an elderly veteran's wheelchair ramp, and finally, 1 17-year-old girl who simply refused to shrink quietly under her narrow, unfair judgment. I didn't set out to change an entire community that afternoon standing frozen near the register. Bag open. Humiliation burning hot across my face in front of strangers. I just wanted to buy wrapping paper. Sometimes the biggest changes really do start that quietly, that unglamorously, that completely by accident. But looking back now, years later, I understand something important I couldn't have possibly understood standing in that exact moment. Dignity doesn't actually require anyone's permission to exist fully. It simply requires enough people, eventually, refusing to accept its absence as something normal any longer. Diane Whitfield decided, long before she ever actually knew anything real about me, that I didn't belong somewhere. She was wrong about that specifically, and eventually, undeniably, about almost everything else she'd built her entire quiet authority upon for over a decade without anyone properly checking her. What she never understood, even at the very end, was that belonging was never actually hers to decide in the first place. Not for me. Not for the Odomwingies. Not for Mr. Thompson. Not for anyone else she'd quietly, confidently judged unworthy over all those unquestioned years. Real belonging, I've come to understand fully since, isn't granted by whoever happens to be standing behind the register with the most immediate authority in that specific moment. It simply exists, plainly, for everyone, until someone with too much unchecked power decides otherwise and gets away with it far too long. Brookstone eventually stopped letting that happen. Not through one dramatic confrontation, but through patient documentation, quiet courage, careful fairness, and enough people finally trusting each other enough to compare their separate experiences honestly, together, out loud, in front of witnesses who could no longer look away. I think about that lesson often now. In new cities, new communities, new rooms full of strangers who have no idea any of this history happened to me. Somewhere, quietly, there's probably another Diane building her own small, unchecked kingdom, confident nobody's paying close enough attention yet to notice the pattern. I pay attention now, deliberately, because of everything Brookstone taught me the hard way. I notice who gets watched more closely in stores, who gets stopped more often at gates, who gets fined for things others never even get questioned about at all in the exact same circumstances. Noticing, I've learned, is really just the necessary first step. The harder, more important part is actually saying something, documenting it clearly, and trusting that enough other people, eventually, will be willing to do the exact same thing alongside you when the moment genuinely calls for it. My father still runs Sterling Group today, quieter about his methods than ever, still believing patience and documentation ultimately outlast anger and impulsive confrontation in almost every meaningful situation worth actually resolving properly instead of just venting about loudly and moving on regardless. My mother still keeps building templates and processes for other communities dealing with their own versions of Diane, quietly consulting, quietly helping, never seeking credit or recognition for any of it, simply believing the work itself matters more than anyone specifically remembering who did it. I still think, sometimes, about that very first hook of a moment, a woman screaming for security, pointing at me like I was already guilty of something I hadn't done. I think about how far that single afternoon eventually traveled, and how much it ultimately, quietly, permanently changed. Brookstone Estates today welcomes new families without the quiet, invisible screening Diane once conducted so confidently for over a decade. The plaza bustles. Mr. still stands. Caleb still rides his bike freely. Nobody measures anyone's belonging by anything except actual, ordinary decency anymore. Diane Whitfield lost her store, her HOA presidency, her carefully built reputation, and eventually, quietly, her entire sense of who she thought she was within that small, unchecked kingdom she'd spent 11 years constructing. She lost all of it, ultimately, over one bag search she never should have demanded. I gained something too, though it took me a long time to properly name it clearly. I gained the specific, hard-won understanding that dignity never actually requires anyone else's permission or approval to exist fully. It simply requires enough people, eventually, refusing to look away from its absence any longer. That's the story, really, underneath everything else. Not a Karen humiliated publicly for dramatic satisfaction, but an entire community slowly, patiently learning how to actually see each other clearly, fairly, and completely, instead of through whatever narrow, unchecked judgment one person had quietly imposed for far too long. I don't know if Diane ever fully understood what she lost, beyond the store and the title and the reputation. I hope, somewhere, she eventually did. Not for my sake specifically, but because genuine understanding, even arriving painfully late, matters more than simply losing things without ever learning anything real from it. As for me, I carry Brookstone with me still, not as a wound anymore, but as a clear, steady lesson about patience, documentation, courage, and the quiet, collective power of people finally choosing to compare their separate experiences honestly, together, instead of carrying them alone in isolated, doubted silence. I walked into that boutique as a girl who just wanted to buy her brother a birthday gift, and I walked out, eventually, as someone who understood exactly how much unchecked power can cost a community, and exactly how much patient, collective courage it takes to finally take it back. The END.